There is a peculiar silence that descends upon naval command centers when admirals realize that their billion-dollar warships have become obsolete not through technological advancement by peer competitors, but through the ingenuity of adversaries operating on budgets smaller than a single destroyer's annual maintenance costs. It is not the silence of tactical defeat, which can be absorbed and adapted to, but the suffocating quiet of strategic irrelevance, where the fundamental assumptions underpinning decades of doctrine evaporate in the space of weeks. We are hearing that silence now in the corridors of the Pentagon, in the operational headquarters of the Fifth Fleet, and in the planning rooms where American strategists are confronting a reality they assured us could never materialize. What we are witnessing in the Red Sea is not merely a temporary disruption to commercial shipping or a manageable security challenge in a distant theater. It is the catastrophic collapse of American naval dominance, the shattering of the myth that sea power and technological superiority can control maritime domains against determined asymmetric resistance. The Houthis, a movement that operates without a navy, without an air force, without any of the conventional military capabilities that strategists insisted were necessary to challenge maritime supremacy, have effectively closed one of the world's most critical waterways to traffic they deem unacceptable. And the United States Navy, the most powerful maritime force ever assembled in human history, has proven incapable of stopping them. For decades, I have studied naval warfare, the projection of power through maritime dominance, and the historical patterns by which sea powers rise and fall. And I tell you now that we have crossed a threshold that future historians will identify as the moment when American naval supremacy, the foundation of post-World War II global order, died not in a climactic battle between fleets, but in the humiliating demonstration that expensive platforms designed for peer conflict are helpless against cheap weapons wielded by non-state actors operating from one of the poorest nations on earth. The assumption that guided American defense spending for generations, that technological sophistication and overwhelming firepower could guarantee control of strategic waterways, has been exposed as a dangerous delusion. The Houthis did not need aircraft carriers or nuclear submarines to achieve what amounts to a blockade of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. They needed modified anti-ship missiles that cost a fraction of the vessels they target, drones assembled from commercially available components, and the political will to sustain operations despite facing retaliation from the world's most powerful military. The panic in Washington is palpable even as official statements maintain the fiction that the situation is under control and freedom of navigation will be restored. They know what every serious analyst now understands. The era of unchallenged American naval dominance is over, killed not by Chinese carrier groups or Russian submarines, but by a ragtag militia operating from the coastline of Yemen with weapons that defense contractors would dismiss as primitive. If you value understanding how military power actually functions in the real world rather than in the sanitized briefings that justify defense budgets, if you refuse to accept the narratives that obscure strategic failure behind tactical details, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. The algorithm suppresses this analysis because it threatens the comfortable assumptions that allow wasteful spending and failed strategies to continue unchallenged. Do not let them keep you ignorant about the most significant shift in naval warfare since the aircraft carrier made the battleship obsolete. We are looking at a transformation that the establishment desperately wants to frame as a temporary challenge rather than the permanent erosion of capability that it represents. The Houthis began their operations against vessels with connections to Israel in response to the war in Gaza, claiming they were enforcing a blockade in solidarity with Palestinians. The Western media initially dismissed this as symbolic posturing, assuming that American naval power would quickly restore order and that shipping companies would ignore threats from a movement without conventional naval capabilities. Instead, we have witnessed a systematic campaign of strikes against commercial vessels that has forced major shipping lines to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles and weeks of transit time to journeys between Asia and Europe. The Suez Canal, one of the most critical choke points in global trade, has seen traffic decline by over 40% because ships are avoiding the Red Sea entirely rather than risk attack. This is not a minor disruption. This is a fundamental reorganization of global shipping patterns driven by the recognition that the United States cannot protect commercial traffic in waters it has dominated since the Second World War. To understand the magnitude of this failure, you must understand what the United States deployed to counter the Houthi threat. Operation Prosperity Guardian brought together a coalition of naval forces, including American Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, equipped with the Aegis combat system, the most sophisticated air defense platform ever created. These vessels carry dozens of interceptor missiles, each costing between $2 and $4 million, designed to track and destroy multiple incoming threats simultaneously. The Navy deployed P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft, providing persistent surveillance over thousands of square miles of ocean. Satellite systems tracked movements across Yemen in real time. Special operations forces provided targeting intelligence. The full spectrum of American military technology, the arsenal that cost taxpayers trillions of dollars to develop and deploy, was brought to bear on a group that the Pentagon initially estimated had perhaps a few dozen anti-ship missiles and some modified drones. Yet, despite this overwhelming technological advantage, despite near-perfect intelligence about Houthi positions and capabilities, despite the ability to strike targets anywhere in Yemen with precision-guided munitions, the attacks continued. Ships were hit. Drones penetrated defenses. The Houthis demonstrated that they could sustain operations indefinitely, while the United States burned through expensive interceptors and struggled to explain why the most powerful navy in the world could not secure a shipping lane against an adversary without a single warship. This is not just operational failure. This is the exposure of a fatal flaw in the entire architecture of American sea power. The cost-exchange ratio is devastating and unsustainable. When a Houthi drone that costs perhaps $20,000 to produce requires a $3 million interceptor to destroy, when a modified anti-ship missile worth perhaps $200,000 forces a billion-dollar destroyer to expend multiple defensive weapons and potentially withdraw from station, the mathematics of attrition warfare overwhelmingly favor the attacker. The United States can maintain this defensive posture for weeks or months by drawing down stockpiles and accelerating production, but it cannot sustain it indefinitely against adversaries who can produce and deploy weapons faster than America can intercept them. The Houthis are not running out of missiles. American ships are running out of interceptors. When destroyers must return to port to reload their magazines, when the Navy acknowledges that it is burning through stocks of standard missiles faster than they can be replaced, when the admission comes that the industrial base cannot surge production sufficiently to meet operational demands, we are witnessing the collapse of sustainable naval presence in the face of asymmetric resistance. But the cost disparity is merely the most visible symptom of a much deeper systemic problem that reveals how disconnected American defense planning has become from the realities of 21st century warfare. The establishment media will tell you that the Houthis are Iranian proxies, that Tehran is orchestrating these attacks, that this is really about containing Iranian influence rather than the specific grievances the Houthis claim motivate their actions. But any student of the region knows this framing is designed to obscure rather than illuminate. The Houthis receive support from Iran, certainly, including weapons technology and tactical training. But they are not remote-controlled proxies executing orders from Tehran. They are an indigenous Yemeni movement with their own political objectives, their own strategic calculations, and their own reasons for challenging American and Israeli interests that have nothing to do with Iranian direction. They have been fighting a brutal war against a Saudi-led coalition that the United States armed, funded, and provided intelligence support for over nearly a decade. They have endured bombing campaigns that killed tens of thousands of civilians and created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. They have watched American-made munitions obliterate Yemeni infrastructure while Washington remains silent about war crimes committed by its Gulf allies. The notion that these operations are simply Iranian provocations rather than the actions of a movement with genuine grievances and independent agency is the kind of analytical laziness that has characterized American policy in the region for decades. The framing matters because it determines the response options that strategists consider viable. If this is an Iranian proxy operation, then escalation against Iran becomes the logical solution. But if the Houthis are independent actors with political legitimacy within Yemen and strategic objectives that extend beyond maritime harassment, then military strikes against Houthi positions do nothing to address the underlying dynamics driving their behavior. The United States can destroy launch sites, eliminate weapons depots, and kill Houthi commanders. It has done all of these things repeatedly over the past months, yet the attacks continue because degrading capabilities does not eliminate the political will to resist, and because the Houthis have demonstrated the ability to reconstitute their arsenal faster than American strikes can deplete it. This is the fundamental lesson that the United States failed to learn from 2 decades of counterinsurgency warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan. You cannot bomb your way to political solutions. You cannot missile strike your way to legitimacy. Military force can destroy targets with precision, but it cannot create the political conditions that lead adversaries to accept your strategic objectives. The Houthis have no incentive to cease operations as long as the war in Gaza continues, as long as they perceive benefit in demonstrating their capability to challenge Western interests, and as long as they face no political consequences from their domestic constituencies for actions that most Yemenis view as justified resistance to foreign domination. To understand why we have arrived at this point of strategic failure, we must strip away the sanitized narratives of defense contractors and examine the actual evolution of American naval doctrine over the past 3 decades. The United States has operated under assumptions forged in the unipolar moment following the collapse of the Soviet Union, when American naval power faced no meaningful opposition and could operate with impunity in waters around the globe. The Navy designed its fleet architecture for peer conflict against China and Russia, investing hundreds of billions in platforms optimized for high-intensity warfare against sophisticated adversaries with advanced anti-access area denial systems, aircraft carriers that cost $13 billion each, destroyers equipped with integrated combat systems that represent the pinnacle of technological achievement, submarines that can operate for months without surfacing. These capabilities were developed to maintain dominance against near-peer competitors who might challenge American access to the Western Pacific or contested waters near Russia. This strategy made sense, after a fashion, as long as the primary threats to American interests came from states with conventional militaries that could be deterred through demonstrations of overwhelming capability. But the world did not evolve according to the scripts written in the Pentagon. While American strategists focused on preparing for battles against Chinese carrier groups in the Taiwan Strait or Russian submarines in the North Atlantic, the actual challenges to American interests emerged from non-state actors and regional powers employing asymmetric strategies that rendered expensive platforms vulnerable rather than dominant. The assumption was that control of the sea required navies, that challenging American maritime supremacy required building fleets that could contest control through force-on-force engagement. What we are witnessing in the Red Sea shatters this assumption completely. The Houthis do not need a navy to deny the United States effective control of waters off Yemen. They need only the ability to threaten shipping with sufficient credibility that commercial operators choose alternative routes rather than risk their vessels and crews. This is anti-access area denial implemented by a non-state actor using weapon systems that cost a tiny fraction of the platforms they threaten, and the United States has no effective counter that does not involve either permanent occupation of Yemeni territory, which is politically impossible and strategically idiotic, or acceptance that maritime domains near hostile coastlines cannot be controlled without prohibitive cost. The historical parallel that haunts serious naval analysts is the transformation that occurred when air power made battleships obsolete in the mid-20th century. Battleships represented the pinnacle of naval technology and the foundation of sea power for generations. Nations invested enormous resources in building and maintaining these floating fortresses, yet within a few years of Pearl Harbor and the destruction of British capital ships by Japanese aircraft, it became clear that the era of the battleship had ended not because a superior battleship design emerged, but because aircraft carriers fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare. We are witnessing a similar transition today. Aircraft carriers and advanced surface combatants represent enormous investments and impressive capabilities, but they are designed for a form of warfare that is increasingly irrelevant to the actual challenges facing American sea power. A Houthi anti-ship ballistic missile does not care how sophisticated the Aegis system is if enough missiles are launched to saturate defenses. A drone swarm assembled from commercial components can overwhelm point defense systems designed to intercept faster, more sophisticated threats. The technological superiority that America has relied upon to maintain dominance is being neutralized by adversaries who accept that they cannot match American capabilities but have discovered they do not need to match them to achieve strategic effects. This brings us to the catastrophic intelligence and planning failures that allowed this situation to develop despite years of warning signs that should have triggered doctrinal adaptation. The United States has been aware of Houthi anti-ship capabilities since at least 2016, when they struck a UAE vessel and damaged a Saudi frigate using missiles that demonstrated sophistication beyond what analysts expected. American intelligence tracked the development of Houthi drone capabilities, the expansion of their arsenal, and the growing effectiveness of their operations against Saudi coalition targets throughout the Yemen war. Yet the Navy proceeded as if these developments were irrelevant to American operations, as if the capabilities that the Houthis demonstrated against regional adversaries would somehow prove ineffective against American vessels with superior defensive systems. This is the arrogance that has characterized American military planning for decades. The assumption that technological superiority guarantees outcomes regardless of adversary adaptation or the specific dynamics of the operational environment. The Houthis studied American capabilities. They tested approaches. They refined tactics. They learned from every engagement. Meanwhile, American planners assumed that presence alone would deter attacks and that if deterrence failed, defensive systems would prove adequate to protect shipping without significant operational disruption. The result of this complacency is strategic humiliation on a scale that the Navy has not experienced since the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War, demonstrated that Persian Gulf operations involved risks that peacetime planning had discounted. The admission that destroyers are running low on interceptors, that the industrial base cannot surge production sufficiently to meet demand, that vessels are being rotated through for magazine reloading more frequently than operational tempo allows. These are not minor logistical challenges. They are indicators of fundamental capability gaps that reveal how unprepared the Navy was for sustained defensive operations against asymmetric threats. The production capacity for standard missiles and other interceptors is limited. Manufacturing these systems requires specialized components, skilled labor, and time that cannot be compressed simply by increasing funding. Even if Congress authorized unlimited spending tomorrow, the physical constraints of production would prevent the Navy from replenishing stocks faster than current operations deplete them. This creates a death spiral where continued operations exhaust munitions, forcing either acceptance of increased risk as magazines empty or withdrawal from station, which amounts to conceding that the Houthis have successfully denied access to waters that American doctrine insists must remain open. But the military failure is merely the visible manifestation of a much deeper rot in the entire framework of American power projection. While destroyers patrol waters off Yemen and aircraft conduct surveillance missions, a far more significant transformation is occurring in the economic architecture that determines which nations control global commerce. The diversion of shipping around Africa is not a temporary inconvenience that will be resolved once military operations restore security. It is becoming the new normal because shipping companies have made a rational calculation that the risk of Red Sea transit exceeds the cost of alternative routing. Insurance rates for vessels transiting near Yemen have skyrocketed, making the longer route around the Cape economically competitive, even accounting for additional fuel and time. Port infrastructure is adapting to new traffic patterns. Supply chains are being restructured around the assumption that Suez Canal traffic will remain depressed. The longer this situation persists, the more permanent these adaptations become, and the less leverage the United States has to restore the previous order, even if it somehow manages to suppress Houthi capabilities. This transformation has triggered consequences that extend far beyond shipping logistics and into the fundamental structure of global economic power. The Suez Canal generates approximately $9 billion annually in revenue for Egypt, a critical American ally whose stability depends partly on these funds. The decline in traffic threatens Egyptian finances and potentially the political order that has maintained peace with Israel and cooperation with American regional objectives. European economies that depend on efficient maritime connections to Asian manufacturing are facing increased costs that contribute to inflation and economic stagnation. The ripple effects of Red Sea disruption are manifesting in delayed shipments, increased consumer prices, and supply chain fragility that compounds other economic stresses facing the developed world. This is asymmetric warfare, achieving strategic effects without the asymmetric actor needing to directly strike American territory or even American military assets. The Houthis are strangling commerce, demonstrating that control of choke points provides leverage that superior naval power cannot easily counter, and exposing the brittleness of just-in-time global supply chains that assume maritime security as a given rather than a condition that must be actively maintained. The Global South is watching this transformation with intense interest and drawing conclusions about the reliability of American security guarantees and the wisdom of continued dependence on Western-dominated systems. When developing nations observe that the United States cannot protect commercial shipping in waters where it maintains permanent naval presence, when they see that asymmetric capabilities can successfully challenge American dominance, when they witness that resistance to Western preferences does not inevitably trigger overwhelming retaliation that crushes the resistant party, they are recalculating their strategic positions. The Middle East, in particular, is undergoing a dramatic shift in threat perception and alliance calculus. Gulf states that have relied on American security guarantees for decades are increasingly hedging their relationships, pursuing diplomatic normalization with Iran, investing in Chinese infrastructure projects, and signaling that their future security will depend on regional arrangements rather than external protection that has proven unreliable. The Abraham Accords and the architecture of Israeli-Arab normalization that was supposed to isolate Iran and cement American influence are being overtaken by the reality that Iran and its aligned movements have demonstrated capabilities that American power cannot suppress. Iran itself has achieved a strategic victory in the Red Sea without firing a shot or providing overt support that would justify direct American retaliation. Whether or not Tehran is orchestrating Houthi operations, and the evidence suggests the relationship is more complex than simple command and control, Iran benefits enormously from the demonstration that American naval power can be challenged successfully. Every day that Houthi operations continue, every ship that diverts around Africa, every interceptor missile that American destroyers expend, strengthens the narrative that Iran has been promoting for years. Resistance to American hegemony is possible. Alignment with Washington brings vulnerability rather than security. The regional order can be shaped by regional powers rather than external intervention. This is psychological warfare achieving effects that conventional military operations could not accomplish. The United States can strike Iranian facilities. It can impose additional sanctions. It can escalate military pressure. But doing so in response to Houthi operations would validate the very connection between Iran and the Houthis that gives Iran leverage, while failing to address the underlying dynamic that makes Houthi resistance sustainable regardless of Iranian support levels. We have entered a phase of naval warfare that the United States is structurally unprepared to win and economically incapable of sustaining indefinitely. The fundamental equation has shifted. For centuries, sea power meant the ability to control maritime domains through superior fleets that could defeat rival navies and protect friendly commerce. This paradigm assumed that challengers would contest control through force-on-force engagement that favored the side with larger, more sophisticated platforms. Asymmetric warfare has shattered this paradigm. Control of seas now requires not just the ability to defeat opposing navies, but the capability to suppress threats from shore-based systems, non-state actors, and distributed networks that present no concentrated targets for conventional naval power to destroy. The cost of maintaining control has increased exponentially, while the benefits of that control have diminished as adversaries discover they can achieve strategic effects by denying access rather than seeking to defeat American forces in direct combat. The desperation in Washington is evident in the incoherent policy responses that oscillate between escalation and restraint without achieving either deterrence or resolution. The administration has authorized strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen, conducting bombing raids that the Pentagon claims degraded capabilities by 30%. Yet the attacks continue at similar frequencies, suggesting either that the damage assessments were wildly optimistic or that the Houthis possess deeper reserves and reconstitution capabilities than intelligence estimated. The political constraints on escalation are severe. Massive bombing campaigns that might significantly suppress Houthi capabilities would require striking targets in populated areas, creating civilian casualties that would unite regional opinion against the United States and potentially topple allied governments that are already facing domestic pressure over their relationships with Washington. Limited strikes demonstrate military capability but do not meaningfully alter Houthi behavior because the political will to resist remains intact, and the material capabilities can be rebuilt faster than precision strikes can degrade them. The United States is trapped between unacceptable escalation and ineffective limited action, paralyzed by the recognition that neither approach offers a viable path to restoring the maritime security that American power was supposed to guarantee. This geopolitical transformation is already manifesting in ways that directly affect your economic security and quality of life, regardless of where you live or whether you pay attention to foreign policy. The inflation that is eroding purchasing power and reducing living standards across the developed world has multiple causes, but one significant factor is the increased cost of maritime shipping driven by Red Sea disruptions. When vessels must transit around Africa, fuel costs increase. When insurance rates spike due to security risks, those costs are passed to consumers. When supply chains experience delays, scarcity drives prices higher. The chaos in the Red Sea is not an abstract problem affecting distant shipping companies. It is a direct contributor to the economic pain that ordinary people experience when they shop for groceries, pay rent that reflects increased costs for imported goods, or face unemployment as businesses struggle with disrupted supply chains. The empire is coming home in the form of economic misery that results from the collapse of systems that Americans were told would provide prosperity and security forever. The military-industrial complex that has consumed trillions in defense spending is being exposed as fundamentally unable to address the threats that actually challenge American interests. The Navy has invested hundreds of billions in platforms optimized for peer conflict while remaining vulnerable to cheap weapons wielded by non-state actors. The industrial base cannot produce sufficient quantities of the munitions needed for sustained operations against distributed threats. The doctrine remains focused on scenarios that become less relevant with each passing year while the actual challenges multiply. This is not a problem that can be solved by increasing defense budgets or developing more sophisticated weapons systems. It is a structural failure that requires fundamental rethinking of how sea power functions in an era of proliferated precision strike capabilities, unmanned systems, and asymmetric strategies that render expensive platforms vulnerable rather than dominant. But such rethinking would require the defense establishment to admit that its core assumptions were wrong, that the strategies it has pursued for decades have failed, and that the business model of American military power is obsolete. The institutional incentives all point toward denial, toward doubling down on failed approaches, toward demanding more funding for capabilities that have proven inadequate, while suppressing analysis that suggests the entire framework needs reconstruction. We are standing at the twilight of American naval dominance, watching the sun set on an era that began with the Second World War and is ending not in climactic battles but in the humiliating demonstration that expensive ships cannot control waters against determined resistance from adversaries who refuse to fight according to rules that favor American capabilities. The Red Sea collapse is not an isolated incident that can be managed through tactical adjustments. It is a revelation of permanent vulnerability, a glimpse of the future where American power projection confronts limits that technology cannot overcome and budgets cannot erase. The choice facing the United States is as stark as it is urgent. There is no middle path that preserves dominance while acknowledging limitations. The first path is the path of strategic adaptation and painful honesty. It requires admitting that the era of unchallenged American naval supremacy is over, that maritime security in contested waters now depends on political arrangements rather than military dominance, and that the Navy must be restructured away from expensive platforms designed for peer conflict toward distributed capabilities that can operate sustainably in environments where adversaries possess effective anti-access capabilities. It would mean accepting that some waters cannot be controlled at acceptable cost, that commercial shipping must adapt to new risks rather than depending on military protection that cannot be guaranteed, and that the United States must pursue diplomatic solutions to conflicts that military force cannot resolve. This path leads to a smaller but more sustainable fleet, reduced overseas commitments, and a recognition that sea power in the 21st century requires different capabilities than those that dominated the 20th. It offers the possibility of avoiding catastrophic escalation while husbanding resources for challenges that truly threaten core interests. The second path is the path of denial and escalatory desperation. It involves insisting that temporary setbacks can be overcome through additional force, that the solution to asymmetric threats is overwhelming application of military power regardless of cost or consequences, and that American credibility requires demonstrating dominance even in situations where such demonstrations are strategically counterproductive. It means expanding operations against the Houthis despite evidence that strikes do not achieve sustainable suppression of capabilities. It risks direct confrontation with Iran through escalation spirals that begin with retaliation for proxy actions and end in regional conflagration. It perpetuates the fantasy that the industrial base can be surged to meet unlimited munitions demands despite physical constraints on production. This path leads inevitably to catastrophic overextension, to conflicts that drain resources without achieving objectives, and potentially to direct war with adversaries who possess capabilities to inflict costs that American society is unprepared to accept. Tragically, every indication suggests the establishment has chosen the second path because acknowledging the first would require admitting that the entire structure of American sea power requires fundamental reformation. The defense contractors that profit from expensive platforms will lobby against distributed systems. The admirals whose careers were built around carrier operations will resist doctrine that diminishes the centrality of these vessels. The politicians who have used military strength as proof of American exceptionalism will reject narratives of limitation. The foreign policy establishment that has defined credibility as the willingness to use force will oppose strategies that accept constraints on power projection. They would rather see American naval power bleed out in unsustainable operations against asymmetric threats than confront the reality that the era of dominance has ended. The collapse of American naval control in the Red Sea is a warning about the fragility of systems that appear invulnerable until the moment they fail completely. The global order built on assumptions of American sea power, guaranteeing freedom of navigation, protecting commercial shipping, and projecting force wherever interests require is crumbling because those assumptions no longer reflect the distribution of capabilities or the willingness of adversaries to challenge dominance. The Houthis have demonstrated that determined resistance with modest capabilities can achieve strategic effects against the most powerful navy in history. Other actors are watching and learning. The precedent has been established. The emperor has no clothes, and everyone can see the nakedness, no matter how frantically the court insists the robes are magnificent. This channel exists to tell you the truths that the establishment buries beneath propaganda and distraction, to analyze the world as it operates rather than how defense contractors and think tanks wish it operated. The algorithm suppresses this content because it threatens comfortable narratives that justify continued funding for failed strategies. If you want to understand the forces reshaping military power and global order, if you refuse to accept sanitized accounts that obscure strategic failure, then subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Do not let them keep you ignorant about transformations that will determine the world your children inherit. I want to hear your analysis in the comments below. First, do you believe the United States can restore maritime security in the Red Sea through military means? Or has the Navy permanently lost the ability to guarantee freedom of navigation in contested waters against asymmetric threats? Second, as other non-state actors and regional powers observe Houthi success in challenging American naval dominance, will we see proliferation of similar strategies that render expensive platforms obsolete across multiple theaters? Write your answers below. I will be reading them. Stay vigilant.